in both of your professional opinions, and you were the investigators on the site, why did James Dean die? Let's ask you that.
Well, I blame it on the no lights. Now the new cars now, just like we've got an 03 Buick, you turn you drive, you have lights on it all the time.
So they did a blood alcohol test on Dean's body and
no alcohol.
No alcohol. Now I've heard reports that there wasn't enough blood left in his body. I mean, is that another urban legend?
That's a bunch of baloney because he didn't bleed that much.
So they could have gotten a
Oh, certainly, yeah, because he had a minimal amount of injuries on his face or the rest of his body that would trigger a lot of blood flowing. It just wasn't that much.
I thought his face, you know, except for the bruise on his head there, that his looked fairly natural.
Well, if you didn't look at his neck and everything, I thought he had a broken neck, and he had some abrasions about him, but nothing that looked really bad.
Now you had mentioned something about you thought that he might have actually even collided with the car. His head might have hit the car.
I think his head came in contact with the right front fender of Turnip Seed's car.
And that would be because he was trying to get around the car and it would have collided. Oh, okay. Was that car street legal? It was a race car. Was it legal to actually drive that car on a public highway back then?
Well, it had all the things that the car is supposed to have. It had a horn and windshield wipers and bumpers and engine and muffler and everything else. So it was street legal as far as we could determine.
You already said that you didn't think there was speeding on Dean's.
No, I went to took a speed kids class after that, and even at the time, 45 feet after point of impact, and 15 feet for turnip seed. You know, that's no 90 miles an hour. If he'd been going 90 miles an hour, I don't think there'd been anything left of the car or even the mechanic that was with him.
And the car was pretty mangled, but it was...
Oh, yes. It only traveled 45 feet.
Now, Dean's passenger, Ralph Viederich,
yes.
Viederich, he was thrown from the car, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, when you arrived at the crash scene, was he already in the ambulance?
No, they were loading Dean first, and then they were putting Viederich in, and I didn't have occasion to talk to him at the scene, nor to Dean.
So you didn't speak to either of them. You did speak to Viederich later, correct?
Later, I spoke with him at the hospital, yes.
Okay.
But Dean was DOA at the Paso Robles Hospital, dead on arrival, and had been taken to the mortuary by the time I got there, because it was sometime before either Ron or I could leave the scene, because we had to get the scene clean, cleaned up first. So it took a little while. In fact, the dispatcher had gotten word that there was James Dean in the accident. And the only way I know that he found that out is because that night, the Paso Robles High School football team was playing the Bakersfield High School football team. And the two men that owned the Paso Robles radio station came through the accident scene shortly after it happened, and they found out that it was Dean, and they called it into their network so they could get credits for it and all, I guess, which the news media does. Anyhow, once the news media got hold of it, everybody knew. And we got calls, kept getting calls from our dispatcher asking when we were going to be 1098 at the scene, which means completed at the scene. And this never happened at accidents. They let us finish our job at the accident, and then if they had traffic for us on the radio, they would call us later. But they called me several times, and then I said, I'll let you know when I'm through here, but I'm not through yet. Well, when I finally did get the chance to talk to the dispatcher, he said that he had been bombarded with calls, and the hospital had been bombarded with calls. Everybody wanted to know something, but they weren't talking because neither Ron nor I had arrived at the hospital. We were still out at the scene. unbeknownst to us at the time, the ambulance had an accident on the way to the hospital.
Yeah, you were telling me about that.
It was excuse me, a minor accident. It was a head-on sideswipe, just a couple of miles from the accident scene. But we neither one knew about that till we got into the hospital.
So Dean and Viterick are in the
ambulance that has an accident with another car.
So the ambulance has another accident.
Yeah, right. But it didn't. They just exchanged names, and phone numbers, addresses, and all. So it didn't delay them too long. So he was able to get going again to the hospital. And when he did get to the hospital, they told us this later that every phone was ringing off the hook because the news media wanted more information on it, but they didn't have anything to tell them because they didn't know anything. So it fell on our shoulders to notify, and we still didn't know too much about Dean other than what they could tell us there. So I went over to talk to the doctor and asked him if he'd gotten anything out of the Viterick, because Dean had been transferred to the mortuary already. And he says, no, he just can't seem to get anything out of him. I don't know. Maybe it's because he's from Germany. He's from the Porsche factory, and maybe he doesn't speak English. I says, okay. So I went over to talk to him, and I spoke with him in English. No response at all. So then I speak German. So I speak German. So I spoke to him in German, and boy, his eyes popped open right now. He was very receptive to my voice.
What did he say to you?
Well, just that they had an accident, and he didn't know too much about it, because, of course, he couldn't talk much. He was in a state of shock, you know, with the broken jaw and everything else. We couldn't talk too much. So I didn't want to push it, you know, with him being in an injured condition. And then I went down to the mortuary to get some information on Dean, driver's license information and so forth. And fortunately, the owner of the mortuary's wife had just read an article on James Dean in the Saturday Evening Post. So she filled me in on his whole life practically, so I learned a great deal, because I didn't know who he was. I thought it was James Dean, the sausage maker, you know.
That's what I thought.
Is that right? Yeah. So you didn't know?
I had never heard of him. He only made 3 films. He had just finished filming Giant, and the studios, to my understanding, we found out later, had taken away his driver's license because he was considered a wild driver. And so they had taken away his driver's license. He'd just gotten it back because they had just finished filming.
I guess you're about the best looking gal we've seen around here in a long time, I think. Prettiest than I think I've seen down here.
Well, thank you, Jen.
There are so many stories that have started with that accident. Even in our local newspaper several years ago, they were talking about the fiery crash of James Dean's vehicle. There wasn't a spark in the whole thing, let alone a fiery crash. And you hear all kinds of stories.
You were the main investigators. Do you know if there were other investigators from the police departments or any other agencies that worked on this?
Well, first of all, nobody had jurisdiction but the Highway Patrol, and I don't know of any city police department that would come out there in the wide open spaces and try to have an investigation unless there was something that we had done wrong and possibly one of their people had been involved. But I have heard of no investigation other than some of these private agencies have gone out on their own and done what they could, you know.
Something that's related to where we are back in Newhall, there was a Tips was a restaurant down there at the time. There was a waitress who said that James Dean and Ralph Viterick stopped in that day on the way up. And she claimed later that some investigators came back and asked the Tips crew if they served Dean alcohol that day. Did you ever hear anything about that?
Never. We always, in the county, I think it's probably done statewide, maybe even nationwide, they run a blood alcohol test on all fatalities, and there was no sign of any alcohol. The district attorney who would do any prosecution in this case said that there was insufficient evidence, they thought, to prosecute Turnipseed, the other driver, for her violation of right-of-way, and they couldn't prosecute Dean because he was deceased. So they decided to have the coroner's inquest, and of course we had to both testify, and the coroner's jury came back with an open verdict, which indicates it was probably a case of both of them being to blame, and they decided not to prosecute. And they asked me if it was okay with me, and I said, sure, I'm not going to argue that. And it didn't stop there. It kept on going for months, and then it kept on going for years, until about after 50 years it started to die down.
We've come to the end of our tale today at the site of the end of James Dean's life, but as you've all seen today, the story will never be completely told. I think we learned some new things today and maybe busted a few myths. We want to thank everybody that helped us with this production today, and especially the Jack Ranch Cafe. So from Show Lamb, California, this is E.J. Stevens saying thank you for joining us.